I made this long case clock 5 or 6 years ago. It's a very good example of the uses to which we woodworkers put planes. Apart from preparing all the framework with bench planes before making the joinery, and then of course toothing it before we lay the veneer, there's all these mouldings. This cornice mould, for instance, is done with circular planes, and you'll see that it is totally different from this moulding at the top of the waist. This is because we perceive mouldings by the light they reflect, and of course we're looking up into the cornice mould and we're looking directly at this mould at the top of the waist. At the bottom of the waist we've got another moulding which is almost identical to this one, but it's inverted because we look down into it. And then right at the very bottom we've got a plinth mould with a little ovolo on it. But apart from the mouldings, we've got rebates around the doors. We've got a rebate to hold the glass. And then last but not least, we've got grooves to hold the panels. So you will see there are a multitude of purposes for which we require planes. So let's go into my workshop and look at some. Now you remember when we were looking at the long case clock just now, we saw what an important feature the rebates were. Were they rebates? Rabbits? Well, quite honestly, they're neither really, because the name is a corruption of the French word rebate, which is French for plane. Now, let's really look at that rabbit again. Let's look at a really big one. This is the sill of a sash window frame. It's bedded on the outside wall, represented by this red. Here is the mortar that the frame's bedded on, and the frame has a little groove in it here, look, for the mortar to squeeze up into, so that we don't, when the sill shrinks, we don't get a straight hole right through here. Here on this rebate we've got a little slope which is called the weathering. That's to throw the rain off, and it runs down here, and to stop the rain running back under here, it gets as far as here and it won't go uphill, so it forms in here and then drips off. We've got a similar thing here to stop the rain blowing up the front of the window. Here is the rebate that the actual sash fits down into, and again we've got a little check groove here, look. Over the top here we've got a groove for the ventilating bead. Then we've got a little piece of ornamental stuff really. This is a little Roman ovolo, just to take the hard corner of the sill off indoors. Down here we've got a groove for the window board. So we have all those features. And then when we put the sash in down here, this is the bottom rail of the sash, look, which fits in that rebate. It has a little capillary groove here to stop the water going back here through capillary attraction. It has a rebate here for the glass and putty. It's got a Grecian ovolo on the inside here. The difference between the two ovolos, you'll notice, the Grecian is part of an ellipse and the Roman is part of a circle. Then we've got the ventilating bead which fits in here, which has got this check on the inside and a quirk bead on the top corner. This quirk bead miters with the staff beads around the rest of the sash window. Here is the window board, which drops in there like so, tongued into the sill, and it has a groove here for the plaster to go into. The window board is actually fixed first and the plasterer, when he plasters, it squeezes up in here. If this window board shrinks, we don't get a nasty gap here, and if it shrinks this way, we don't get a dirty gap here because it's only the tongue that takes that movement up. So you see, we've got all these features work with planes, starting at the nosing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. 19 different features, all work with a plane. Now, one of the biggest tasks is removing all this wood from this great big rabbit. So let's have a go at that next. Of course, the sill would probably be hardwood, which would make our life even more difficult. But here we've got a piece of softwood. We need to mark the rebate out first, and we do that by gauging its width. Now I'm using a mortise gauge that's put in 2 lines down there. The reason being that the planes I'm going to use don't have any fences, so I need something to delineate the far side of the rebate. The depth of the rebate I'm going to mark with a ordinary marking gauge, and the square line of the rebate I mark with a gauge. So this is the square line of the rebate, and that line is the amount of slope in the rebate. So I'm going to plough a groove first. Now, as I'm going to deal with grooves in a minute, you'll just have to bear with me. I don't want to do a lot of explaining. Now, this is an old wooden plough. Just look at what it's knocking out. Now we can take some hefty shavings with this wooden badger. There we go. In actual fact, we can take a little bit more with that. Let's have a dockyard sharp. That's better. Now I'm watching the lines here. These big old thick shavings make a most satisfying sound. Now when I'm almost down to that line, I change planes. There we are. Now I need to put the weathering on. So that's it, the rebate square. Now I'm going to plane the slope onto it. So I'll plane that down until I meet the other gauge line. flat surface down to the gauge line. Now I expect you were wondering how I'm going to get that little quirt in there. Well, it's this funny little plane, and that works the throat, and it runs in there like that. Has an automatic depth stop built into it. Now there's a wide rabbit with weathering and a throating. Well, what happens when we want to work much smaller rabbits, where we don't need that groove to start with? Let's look at that next. Here's a piece of ordinary prepared wood with our face and face edge. And we've got a blue line down the back edge there, look. And we could work a rebate over here. Now, if we're working on the back side, because this is our face, the fence has got to run on here, but we've got to cut over there. So we use a tool called a sash fillister. There we are, the fence is running on the face. It's been set up. Here's the depth stop that's going to give us the actual depth. And this little pattern here is a piece of boxwood called the boxing, let in to make the sole of the plane hard wearing. So there we go. Look how sweet that's cutting. There we are. Depth stop, stopping the cut. I enjoyed doing that. There we are, a rabbit on the back edge. Now, what happens if we want one on this corner? Well, we don't need to reach over the job. So we can use this plane, which is called a moving fillister. The fence is screwed to the bottom of the plane, and it works over like so. We're not going to leave much wood on this edge, but there we go. Well, there we are. Now both of those operations could have been done with a metal tool like this, but you saw how sweet those wooden planes run on there, and I love using them. So it's wooden planes for me, but you can buy one of these down at the local ironmongers. So there we are, rabbit on both edges. Do you remember this old friend that I used a little while ago and went like a bull at a gate and promised that I'd show it later on? Well, here it is. The wooden plough, a very, very simple tool, may look complicated, but don't let that fool you. It literally comprises of an ordinary plane, just a plain body, on two rods, wedge held with a fence. On the underside we've got a skate and a depth stop. The depth stop is controlled by this wing nut on the top, which winds it up and down. Really, that's all there is to it. It comes normally with a set of 8 irons. They're numbered 1 to 8. The 8 is a 1/2 inch, the 1 is an 1/8. If you turn them over, you'll see they've all got a little groove up the back. How do we put these irons in the plane? Well, we have to take it out first. Now this applies to all wooden planes, well, nearly all wooden planes. To take an iron out, you drive it in. You'll notice that the irons are wedge shaped. So it's pretty logical. If you bang them in, they're loose and you can pull the wedge out with your fingers. You don't have to bang this part with a hammer. So there's the iron. Now if we look underneath at the skate, this back skate has got a little V on the front of it, and that V fits in this groove that's up the centre of the back of most of the irons. So when we put the iron in, you'll see that it automatically centres on the skate. That groove locates the iron. Well, there we are. That's pretty simple. We can adjust the fence. You can put it in position more or less by hand. And when you've got it nearly where you want it, you just clip it firm with the wedges, and if you tap on the end of the beams, you'll pull it in. There we are. One of the important things to remember is the fence is sort of swivelable. In other words, it will go out of parallel very easy. So when we set it up, we have to be careful to make sure that the fence is parallel with the body. There we are. Adjust the depth, and there we are, ready to use. Let's get these out of the way. Now you're going to find a plough like this with a full set of irons for less than £10. Occasionally you'll see one of these that is a work of art. In other words, it's got a handle, it's made of exotic wood, it's got screwed stems with wooden nuts on. All the fittings are probably nickel plated. They're really fantastic things, but they're a collector's item, and they fetch well into 3 figures. It's not necessary for our work. So let's use the beast. Now you saw just now when I ploughed that sill that it really tore the wood out, and I do mean tear. So we need to take some precautions that it doesn't tear the surface away. So we always mark the groove that we're going to plough with a wooden plough with a mortise gauge. So there we are. We've marked the actual groove. 2 nice deep cuts from a mortise gauge set up to the width of the iron. Look at that. There we go. There we are, down to the depth stop. Now look at that. How long did that take? We've got a tool, a set of irons, 8 different widths, and we can work a groove in that length of time, almost as quick, if not quicker, than an electric router. And what have we spent? Less than the cost of 1 electric router cutter. And we didn't have any noise or dust. Okay, that's quite a crude tool. Now what do we do when we want something sort of precise and pedantic? Well, we can go down to this little fella. This was made originally by Record. This is the Record 043. Unfortunately, it's not made anymore, but there's stacks of them about second hand. Just look at this. Look at that. A real precise groove, ideal for grooving the sides of drawers to take the bottom, preparing little mouldings, all sorts of things where we want to be super accurate and precise. It makes grooves up to 1/4 of an inch wide. What happens when we want to go wider? Well, we can use its big brother. This is the 044. Exactly the same story. Unfortunately, it's not made anymore. There are patterns of the 044, and I think it's called the 044A or something like that. But it's not a patch on the old pattern. The new one's got a horrible shaped plastic handle, very difficult to control. And there we go. So there we are, 3 grooves. Well, that's fine, but we've got specific sizes of irons. Now, unfortunately, suppose we were going to put a ply panel in one of these grooves. Now, ply has a tolerance of plus or minus 1/2 mil on its width. So we might not have an iron that fits the ply perfectly. So suppose we're putting a panel in, the panel could be loose for one plough iron, or wouldn't go in another one. So we're in a fix. Well, there's a tool to make these grooves wider. You previously saw this, which I said I'd picked up because the guy didn't know what it was. I prefer the pair. These are a left and right hand side rebate. And what they do, they actually take a shaving off the side of the groove. So we can actually widen the groove one shaving at a time. So there you are, a shaving off the side of the groove. So we can increase the width of the groove a shaving at the time to make it a precise width. Well, that's fine. We've got 3 grooves in the face of a bit of wood. But what happens when we want a groove on the edge, as in a tongue and groove joint, which is very common, isn't it? Let's look at that next. Here's one of our boards, look, pop him in the vise, block of wood behind to stop it wobbling about too much. Now these planes are very, very easy to get. They're sort of not used anymore, so they're about in abundance. They're a wooden grooving plane and a wooden tonguing plane, and they're made in pairs to suit a certain thickness of board. If you really want to work with antique tools, well, they're there, but they are a bit long-winded, rather nice to use. I prefer this chap. Now that's not a push me pull you at all. What it is, it's a tonguing plane on this side, the fence is in the middle, and on the other side we've got the grooving plane. So let's work the groove first on this edge. Straightforward. The plane stops automatically when the groove has reached the required depth. There's no particular skill required to do this, other than to be able to sharpen and set the tool up, which just follows normal procedure. So there we are, we've just about reached the, there we are, full depth groove. That's the groove. We'll put him there while we make a tongue. So this time we just turn the plane round. Instead of using it that way, we use it that way. You can begin to see the tongue forming. Again, the plane stops automatically when it's reached the top of deck. I find this very satisfying, taking these shavings off like this. There we are, we're just coming down to the deck. So, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. A perfectly fitting tongue and groove. That was easy, wasn't it?
Excellent, Bob.
So, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. A perfectly fitting tongue and groove. That was easy, wasn't it? Well, there you are, some of my moulding planes. I suppose you could say I'm lucky. I inherited a lot of them. My family are all woodworkers. In fact, old Granny Gadd used to say we've been woodworkers since Noah built the ark. Anyway, there we are. Along the top, there's some pretty big nondescript ones. Here we've got rounds and hollows. Now, let's get one thing straight before we go any farther. This is a round. And this is a hollow. In other words, the name of the plane is the shape of the sole, not the shape of the moulding it cuts, which a lot of people get muddled up with because all the other moulding planes are named by the shape of the moulding. So here are ovulos, mainly sash ovulos. Here I've got some odds and sods, but these are all OGs. Quirk beads through to there, and then some astragals and other various things like dust-proof case planes and so on. Now most of those planes you can find at car boot sale or junk sale, and in some marketplaces you get a stall holder that sells old tools. But don't be fooled. You need only pay from £1.50 to £5. More than £5 is out of the question. There are certain planes that are stamped with a name that collectors are looking for, and they'll pay the earth, but you don't need those. You may find a plane with two irons. That's quite useful because it's much easier to shape the irons to fit the sole and to adjust the plane, but of course these are going to cost you a bob or two more. You may find a biggie like this. It's not worth buying, quite frankly. You can do all that this does with hollows and rounds. This takes so much energy to push, so much trouble to sharpen and shape accurately, that it's just not worth it. You may even find a plane, a moulding plane, as big as this jack plane. In fact, it will look just like a jack plane, except it will have a shaped sole. Now that dates back to years ago when they worked cornices with this whacking great plane. But the problem was that it was too much for one craftsman to push and control. So what did they do? They bored a hole through the front of the plane here, put a knot of sash cord through it, and the poor old apprentice had to pull the plane. So he put his foot against the end of the bench and pulled, and the craftsman held the plane onto the job. But if the apprentice pulled crooked and pulled the plane off of the job, he got his ears boxed, probably with a bit of 4x2. Anyway, let's take a plane to the bench and make it work. Now, just what are you looking for when you go to buy one of these? Well, first and foremost, it's possible that it's been kept in somebody's garden shed. Poor old Uncle Harry's died and they've put his tools in there, forgot all about them, and then thought they might be worth a bob or two. Rust is your biggest problem. Just like we had with the plough, we knock the iron in to take it out. And if it's still stiff and you do need to bash the wedge, lay it on the bench like this and just tap it there gently. See how easy that comes out? Now what are we looking for? Well, first let's inspect the iron. Is it nice and shiny here? In other words, if it's really rust pitted, and if you can't get the wedge off the iron because it's stuck on there with rust, forget it. But if it's reasonable and it's only surface rust and you can get that off easy, it's a goer. You want a reasonable length of iron left here. You know, you want to be able to use it and sharpen it, and this is going to get shorter as you sharpen it. Not a lot, but you'll find some old planes are right down on their last unkers. Leave them alone. You do need a good iron. That is most important. Let's look at the body. Now, first and foremost, you'll notice that the medullary rays on the end of the actual plain body are almost vertical. They're at 90 degrees to the sole. This means it was cut radially from the tree, and the wood, when it expands and contracts, will expand and contract evenly. It won't twist and warp. The next problem is, if you look at the plane's body very carefully, you'll see that all of this side has been cut away. Right across, you've only got this tiddling little bit of wood that's keeping the front to the back of the plane. Now, if this has been banged in tight, and it's been in the garden shed in the damp, and all of this is expanded, this here, because it's cut, moves, and this can't. So you've got a banana shaped plane. Well, if it's gone far, it's just not worth touching, leave it alone. So the things to look for is the truth of the plane, the state of the iron. Don't matter about the wedge, because any woodworker can make a wedge. And somebody along the line, 10 to 1, has tried to bash it out by just banging here. May even have broke the top of the wedge off. Okay, if the rest of it looks good, you may even have to drill what remains of the wedge to get it out. But you've got yourself a plane. Now, one of the problems, of course, is the beast has got to be sharpened. And look at that. Doesn't need sharpening all that often, because let's face it, you don't plane all day long with a moulding plane, but it needs sharpening, and you will need some shaped slipstones. I find these stones that are called engineer's stone files are very, very useful, because they're fitting all of these little shapes. Now, providing the sole of the plane is in good condition, you must keep the iron the exact shape of the sole. So as you sharpen it and you rub little bits away, you need to keep trying the iron back in like that and sighting down the plane just as I am now to see that this iron is exactly the shape of the sole. You never, never, never alter the sole of the plane to fit an iron that you've shaped out of shape. You can see what would happen. You start with an ovolo and end up with a scotia otherwise. So there we are. You've got your plane. Let's look at some of the uses we can give. Now, you remember I said that this was cut radially out of the tree and we looked for these medullary rays. Well, that meant that the planes had to be cut out the tree sort of like this, and all the wood between it was wasted. So the wood was quite expensive. And the plane makers wanted to make the plane body as narrow as possible. And they've got a little wheeze to do this. If you think about it, if you cut the plane body square across there at 90 degrees, the sole is only the width of the body. But if you cut it at an angle like that, the sole is now that width. But of course the plane would have to work on the job at that angle. And there are a lot of moulding planes made like that. This angle is called the springing. So let's look at that next, and we'll look at a small moulding plane that can work a moulding for us. Here we've got a pretty little lamb's tongue. It's got boxwood for a sole. You can see the boxing in here. Quite a nice plane. You can see the medullary rays actually on the surface of the plane this time. They're bang on vertical, look. Ideal, exactly what we're looking for. And it goes on the job, but now of course we have to take account of this springing, which pulls it over like that. You can see the actual fence of the mould and if you push that against the job, it will give you the springing angle. So there we go. You don't want too thick a shaving with a moulding plane, or you don't get a nice finish on the face of the moulding. All the planes have got automatic built-in stops, so that when they get to the required depth, they just stop planing. It's much easier planing a long piece of wood with a moulding plane than it is a little short bit, because there's not a lot to hold the fence against. There we are. A lamb's tongue, and it's worked on the springing. So that literally is a single mould. Now we can work ovalos, scotias, OGs, all sorts of things, small ones like this. There's one plane that works square, one moulding plane, and if we go back to our old tongue and grooves board, we can make a piece of matching out of it. And for that, we would use a quirk bead, sometimes called an edge bead. And all it is, now that little groove there with the square bottom, that's the quirk. We've got some lovely names in woodwork. There we are. There we go. A little bead. So now we've actually got a matched piece of tongue and groove. Well, that's fine for all these little narrow mouldings. But what happens when we've got a really wide one? Well, if you've got some hollows and rounds, you can literally work any moulding. So let's look at hollows and rounds. Well, first of all, let's just look at some rounds. Here we've got the smallest round, and here we've got the biggest one. There are 18 hollows in a set, there are 18 rounds in a set. They were sometimes sold as half sets at 9 each. There is a problem, because various makers numbered their planes. They're all numbered on the back 1 to 18 to give their sizes, but unfortunately the manufacturers never got together. So I've got two 14s here made by different manufacturers, and you'll see how much bigger this one is than that. So if you go shopping for hollows and rounds, don't go shopping for them by numbers that are missing out your set. Actually take some profiles by drawing on a piece of paper round the profile of the plane and take that with you. You don't need full sets. Depending on what sort of work you do, you'll know what you require after you've used them a few times. Now there's one other thing we need to look at, and that is the skew mouth. Now, if you look at these two planes, you'll see that the mouth of this round is almost at 90 degrees to the side of the plane, and this one is at 45. Well, I wonder why. Very difficult to explain. Probably the simile I'll give you now is the best way. Do you remember when you rode a bike up a hill? If you went from side to side, it was much easier because you literally flattened out the length of the hill just to get to the same height. Well, that happens with a skew mouth. With a square mouth, the shaving comes up straight and straight up the iron and out the top. With a skew mouth, it comes off and comes up the iron at an angle. So literally it flattens out the steepness of the iron, therefore it's easier to push. Not only that, it doesn't tear the wood quite as much. So if you look at the old toolmakers catalogues, you find this cost a few more bob than that, and it was more desirable, of course. So giving these hollows and rounds, it means we can work any moulding. Well, how do we go about that? Well, I've made this little model, look, just to try and make the matter clearer. Now, If you look at this represents the enlarged section end of a length of wood, and we're going to work this moulding that we've drawn on the end. The first thing we do, believe it or not, is to do some rabbets and grooves. If you look at this part here, it's just a rebate, and it goes down and it gives us a datum on this surface here. When we looked at the hollows and rounds, you will have noticed there were no stops, so we've got no way of determining the depth they cut to, so we need to put these datums in on the mould. The next thing is this groove, which we've worked here to give us the far side of this little bead, and over here we've worked a groove, and the bottom of it is the datum for this point here. That's fine. The next thing we do is we take our rebate plane and we take all these corners off. Okay, and we probably knock this off with a chisel and then plane it true to give us a datum for the top of the bead, and we've got a little chamfer along here just to give us the two tips of that scotia. And then we can take our hollows and rounds, and with a round we can very easily work this scotia. A hollow round the beads, a hollow round the top of this OG, and then we end up with our finished mould. Now I know what you're thinking. He's covered rebating, grooving and moulding, all with separate planes. Why the hell doesn't he use a combination plane? Well, yeah, there are combination planes. I've got a 45 and a 55 and they're very good tools. But let's face it, you need a driving test first before you can use them, and then an instruction manual, and quite frankly a video of this length is just not the place to cover them. I couldn't do them justice, it wouldn't be fair on the tools or to you, so I'm sorry I haven't covered the combination planes. Well, so far I've only shown you how to work straight wood, but life ain't that easy, is it? You know, we've worked grooves, rebates and mouldings on a straight bit of wood. But most furniture's got some curves in it somewhere. So we have to work mouldings, we have to work grooves, all sorts of things on the curve. And that becomes rather difficult sometimes. Planing. Let's talk about planing to start with. A flat curved surface. Well, without doubt, the old compass plane is probably the easiest tool on a fairly big radius curve like this. It has a spring steel sole that we can adjust from a convex to concave. Smaller curves, we'd probably use a spoke shave. A lot of craftsmen favour the old wooden spoke shave because the solid blade works so well. It's not a bad tool, even on a fairly big curve, as you can see there. Now you probably noticed how that bit in at the bottom, just there. Think of this wood as a bundle of straws. All the wood fibres are a bundle of straws. And when we go down here, we're cutting across the end of the straws. As we get up there, we're cutting into them, so we're forcing them apart. So all curve work has to be plane downhill. So we plane down and then we turn it round and we work back this way. When you've been at it a few years, you just turn the tool round. But to start with, that's not so easy. So the wooden spoke shave. Metal spoke shaves, we try and get in pairs. One has a flat sole, the other one has a round sole. This is a nice pair of old Prestons with adjustable blades, but still spoke shaves are made to this day and they don't cost very much. They're more used on tighter curves than this, of course. The compass plane is exactly the same story as the spoke shave. You need to work downhill, and this applies to pretty well all the tools. We get a funny sort of shaving because it's semi-end grain. Well, that's flat surfaces. You can find old wooden compass planes with an adjustable front. They're quite useful in the workshop because you can alter them, actually plane the sole to fit a radius. So we tend in the trade to make our own. This I made years ago, and the sole has been altered, the radius of the sole, I forget how many times, just to fit different jobs. Eventually it'll be so small and the mouth so wide it'll just get thrown away. Here's a similar thing. Again, workshop made, but this time it's got two curves, one at the front and one at the side. So it was used for working a cove moulding on the circle. Rebates, well, quite simple. We make little rebate planes, made in the workshop, quite easy to make. That one of course had a curved sole, this one is curved the opposite way. Sometimes we make them curved both, but quite frankly these planes and this one are capable of being altered. So we'd make them and use them for the job. We'd make them specifically for a piece of furniture and we keep them, and if we needed something similar again we just alter the plane. Here's a little old moulding plane, look, made out of a scrap of mahogany in the workshop to work a mould on a curve. The iron's just ground to profile, the plane's knocked up in half an hour or so, the wedge has been borrowed for another plane. They're just kept in a box and maybe never used again, sometimes used quite frequently. We saw that grooves and rebates were quite important when we're working mouldings. Well, that is so on the curve as well. You've noticed that there's a curved groove already worked around that piece of wood. Now that's been worked with a most peculiar tool. It's available around second hand still. It looks a wee bit like a spoke shave, but it ain't. You'll see that this has a fence on it. There are other fences in the box. Here's a straight fence which would go on here and just bolt on in place of that one, and here's one for a much tighter curve. The cutter is a most peculiar thing, and this is the big problem looking for this tool second hand is the cutter, because they wear out and there's stacks of these on the market with a worn out cutter and no spare cutters. The cutter is the width of the groove, but if you look at the side of it, it's a most peculiar looking thing. This front part has a little V worked in it, so it forms two little cutting spurs which hang down lower than this back part which forms the blade. So as the cutter goes along the wood, it scores two little grooves, and then the back part takes a shave in between the grooves. So as it has to cut across the grain quite often, it doesn't splinter wood out. And it works round it works around the wood like so, and we have to adjust the cutter in depth. We don't set the cutter to the full depth of the groove to start with. We set it shallow, and after each work round the curve, we just drop the cutter a little bit. It's a long, laborious job, and this is where we can really say that maybe an electric router will beat the hand tools, even for a one-off. But it's still a very good working tool. There are special tools made like this, and this is a circular bead. In other words, it's made to work a bead on the edge of the wood for circular headed windows, and it works round where this one cuts the bead going downhill that way, and very much like the tonguing and grooving plane we saw earlier, we turn it round and it cuts the same the other way, so we work downhill and downhill. All very complicated, but the most simple tool in the workshop is the scratch stock. And quite often it just looks like this. A scrap of wood picked up off the workshop floor, a lump cut out of it, another piece screwed on the face, and a bit of old hacksaw blade or bandsaw blade clamped between them. And that's used to scratch a mould or a groove. Now I've purposely got a bit of deal here, if you can call it deal. It's a bit of old cheap pinus elbow from the local do-it-yourself shop, and wood doesn't come ropier than that. But there you are, we're getting quite a reasonable groove round there. There we are, look, not bad. And of course we work down grain there. Well, it takes time to find a bit of scrap wood in the workshop and make that, so quite often a scratch stock is made up like this as a more permanent tool. Just two pieces of wood with little bolts through them to hold them together, to hold a cutter in place, and a fence which will slide backwards and forwards so you can adjust the cutter from the edge. And on normal hardwood they work famous. So you can make quite a few different little moulds with the scratch stock. Here we've got another one, slightly different pattern, which is much easier to hold where you're working into a tight cove. Here I've got a little bead, look, if it'll work on that. So you see, no money at all, just workshop waste and a broken hacksaw blade. So literally that is a quick look at curve work, but most of the principles we've seen on the straight work applied to the curve. We work the mouldings, rebates and grooves almost the same using these tools. Having worked wood along the grain and sort of round the grain, we're going to work across the grain. Now, a task which appears in the workshop quite often is housing shelves into the side of a cupboard. You know, a bookcase, the shelves go across and they go into a groove across the sides of the cupboard. There are some wooden planes made that will work this. They look like this. They're called trenching planes. They have a little blade and two little spur cutters to sever the grain. Depth stops to stop them when they get to the depth of the housing. If you're given them, accept them, but I don't think they're worth buying. But this is a tool that was made by Stanley, frequently seen at second hand. It's a trenching plane. They're made in various widths. This is a 3/4, for 3/4 shelving. It has a skew mouth, 2 little spur cutters which are adjustable to sever the grain, and a depth stop again which is got a micro adjuster on it. It works against a straight edge. You need to clamp a straight edge across the job, and then it's just a question as soon as the housing is deep enough to contain the plane, you want to take the straight edge away, and I'll tell you why. If you don't, you'll be bandaging your knuckles up, because you tend to hit the end of the straight edge with your knuckles at a certain point. And now away we go. And I haven't got the depth stop set very deep, because once you can see exactly how it works, the deep housing is done exactly the same as a shallow one. So there we are. With a little clean up, we've got ourselves a housing in the side of a bookcase. Well, that's one way of doing it, but there is another way, and probably a more often practiced way. We mark the shelf across the wood with a marking knife, measuring the width of the shelf, and we put ourselves another line. If you are not sure that you can saw square and straight, you may need to square these lines down the edge of the wood, but professionals have to do this so often that they learn to saw down square automatically, so we don't normally put lines on the ends here. You would, as I say, square down here. We don't need it. Now we take a saw and we saw on the inside of these lines, starting over the back first. You notice the saw is going in over that end of the wood first, and then as soon as it's got itself positioned nicely, we bring it down very, very slowly until the whole of the saw is running, and we take the saw cut down to our gauge lines, both front and back. Having done it that side of the housing, we do it on the other side. Exactly the same procedure again. Be careful not to go below your gauge lines, or you've got a nasty saw cut showing on the face of the work. Believe it or not, when cabinet makers worked on the book in London on piecework, if you showed a saw cut there on the end of dovetails, you got fined 6pence. That doesn't sound very much, but of course you only needed a few saw cuts and you've got £1. We can take this out across with a chisel. Don't go right across the work. If you do, you'll split the back out. So we turn the work round, and now we take this out. Now, what we need now is to ensure that this bottom of the housing is the same depth right across. So we use a router for that, and we set the router up down to the gauge line, exactly, and as with the chisel, we don't go right across. We turn around and come back. Now, because I didn't saw quite to the full depth because I didn't want the saw cuts to show, we're left with a fluffy edge. Well, that is easily eradicated. We take a sharp chisel and we just pull it along either side of the housing like this. And we can just clean that away like that. There we are. We've got our housing. So, housing for a shelf and a bookcase. Well, there are other sort of housings, and quite often they're blind. This could have been blind so that it didn't go right through. In that case, we would have chopped a little box here first and then worked into it. A little bit like this. I want to house this piece of sycamore into this piece of mahogany. In other words, I want to let this into there. So I chop this away using a chisel. Now I know what a lot of you Western woodworkers are going to say. He's hitting his chisel with a hammer. And you don't do that, you only hit chisels with a mallet. If you look carefully, you'll see that it's a Japanese chisel and a Japanese hammer, and I can assure you what I'm doing is the correct procedure. And until you've tried this and used these tools, you won't be able to understand the precision that this gives. It's entirely different to our Western way of woodworking, and I hate to say it, but it's far superior. So we've got down somewhere with the hammer and the chisel to there, but what we need now is a nice flat bottom. There we go, a nice flat bottom to the housing to take the glue. This is a little Stanley router, made by Stanley's. Records make one exactly the same. There's a dear little brass casting that some tool shops have that's like this. Both of these are freely available new, or you can make yourself a little baby old woman's tooth like this in the workshop. Nothing very difficult about that at all. Any old plough cutter or combination cutter will do. There's a slightly bigger one with a brass sole, both workshop made. We'll use this little one today just to clean up the bottom of this housing. A little bit more. When you get into the bottom of a housing like this and you just want to take one shaving, what you can do, you can actually pack the router up. If you push the cutter so that it's touching the bottom of the housing, and then just put a shaving, the thickness of a shaving you want to take under either side of the router, like so, and then push a cutter down. That's the actual cut you're going to take off the bottom of the. Hello, we're loose. We'll just clean that up. Yes, these are Japanese chisels as well. Make sure that we're clean absolutely into the corners. We'll turn it upside down. And we'll put our piece of sycamore in the housing like so. And then we will quite a lot of wood to remove to start with. This is a piece of figured sycamore, so the grain's all over the shop. We're going to do a lot better the other way round. I know what you're all waiting to see is how good a fit was it. Well, we'll see that in a second. Allow me to get another plane. There we are, little white diamond of sycamore in a darker piece of mahogany. A task we are repeatedly asked to perform in the workshop is to plane the end of wood square, maybe a mitre, to plane a mitre on a moulding, or even to plane a shoulder on a housing or a tenon. They're all end grain. We use a slightly different plane to those that we've looked at before. This is a typical bench plane with the iron bevel at the back. You will see the size of the mouth. If we turn the plane blade over so the bevel is uppermost, we get a much narrower mouth. Just look at the mouth comparison on these two planes. Now this is going to give us a really precise cut on end grain, and that's what we're after. If you stop and think, we look at mouldings that are mitred and the thing we see is the mitre. We look at drawers and we look how they fit, it's the ends. So we need to plane them very precise. Let's just look at the shoulders first. Well, you plane them what with? A shoulder plane. It come in a variety of sizes, from these great big ones down through smaller and smaller until we get to this little chap. They are all freely available, either new or second hand. Patterns are being made, although they're not made by the original manufacturer, there are patterns made. So to plane the shoulder, let's use a modern shoulder plane. We don't get a very nice shaving on end grain, particularly softwood. This is an old shoulder plane by Thomas Norris of London. That's going to cost you a bob or two, but it certainly works a lot better than the modern ones. There we are. While we've squared up this shoulder, this end grain, you can see we're nice and smooth now. What happens when we want to true the end of a board like this? Well, we need a device to hold it on. We need something that is going to hold the wood square. The plane can run in a rebate to keep that true. So all we have to do now to plane the wood true is to present it to the plane, and we can take one or two nice well, there we are, look, nice and square. Well, that's fine. This is square both ways. What happens when we want to true a mitre, as we've got on the end of this board? Well, we need another device. This is a workshop made device. Its name is a donkey's ear. You can see why. I've never heard it called anything else. Normally it is held by this piece in the front vise on the bench, but so you can see it clearly today, I'm going to try and fix it on the bench just here. And the workpiece sits against the ear like that, and we run the mitre plane there we go. Look at these lovely end grain shavings. So there you are. We've got a reasonable mitre, which could be on a piece of skirting or a plinth, and if this donkey's ear is made accurately, that mitre is going to be a perfect fit. Well, that's fine for mitres across the board. What about the common task of mitering and moulding? Say a picture frame, for instance. We'll use a mitre chute, very similar to the normal mitre shooting board, but of course the stops are on at 45, and we can shoot the moulding by fitting it in here. So we shoot the mitre, so the converse has to be shot on the other side of the board, like that. Well, that's fine. There is another device, quite an old-fashioned tool. I made this one. If you've got a screw box and a tap, you can make one as well, because the only bit that's difficult is this wooden thread. You will see that literally it's a clamp that holds the work, and if we put the work in here and clamp it up like so, it can sit on the bench like this, and we've got a lovely flat surface, and we can plane our mitre true with our block plane. We have to be careful not to plane the device as I have there, or of course it goes out of true, and then the whole thing needs refurbishing. We can also use this tool another way. Suppose we require to square the end of something up, we can clamp it in here, stick it on the bench like so, and by planing this, of course, we true this up to 90 degrees. So that's the mitre screw. There we go. Now I'm going to show you a device which is a copy with a few modifications of the Stanley shooting board, the number 5152 shooting board and plane. Unusual tool, but very, very accurate and much sought after. I couldn't afford to buy one, so I made this. Now that might seem a tall order, you know, make it. A woodworker, what, all this metal work? Well, believe me, it's not that difficult, and I'm not conning you, it is not that difficult. This is a piece of wood. In engineers' terms, it is a pattern. In other words, it is this piece of bronze casting made out of wood. Now, it's not all that difficult for a woodworker to make something like this. The only thing to remember is that it's been moulded in sand up that way, so every part must have a slight taper on it so it can be pulled out of the sand. And you take it to a foundry, and you only need to look in the yellow pages for a foundry, and they will cast you a piece of bronze which is identical to this. The frog is a standard Stanley replacement frog from the ironmongers. The handles are a bit of walnut. The quadrant here is exactly the same as the plane itself. It was a wooden pattern cast. The engraving I paid a local engineering firm to do for me, and they also took this piece of inch plate steel and milled a rebate in it for me. And this stop is just an ordinary piece of inch by half bright steel bolted on, and it contains the plane so that it can't move out of accuracy. So you will see that when we shoot a moulding, look at that, absolute ease. It's got to be at 45, you can't help it. So there is one. There is the other mitre. Just look at that. Look at that. 2 fits like that would kill a horse. Well, we're getting to the end of this video, but there's a few woodworking things that I really want to show you. This is one of them. Now immediately you're wondering, what the hell's that got to do with woodwork? Well, believe it or not, I worked as a model and pattern maker for a while, and this was one of my last jobs. This is the model head that is used on a dummy, and these dummies are used for a variety of reasons. They fire them out of aircraft to test ejection seats. They're used in set up car accidents to film what happens to human bodies, and it's important that they are the exact size and shape of the average person. They are exactly the weight of a human head. So what they've done, they took 1,000 soldiers and they measured them at all points very, very accurately from 3 axes, from an axis here, a plane here and one here. So all the dimensions here are very, very accurate, and these are given, and this had to be made out of lime, which was then cast with an amount of metal to be the exact weight. So there he is. Well, when we've got to do something like that, what tools are we going to use? Well, of course, there are carving tools, but they don't get the right finish. And don't forget, these measurements we've been given are in thousandths of an inch. We're very, very precise. So we use little tools like this. Look at these little darlings. And these are available today from the better tool shops. Brand spanking new. And once the block is made up and roughly carved, we can begin to shape it with these spoke shaves. And they come very much like the full-size spoke shaves that we looked at earlier. Some have round bottoms, others are flat bottoms. And I've literally shaped them to suit my use. Nothing very fancy about those. Last of all, there's this little chap, and this is a little beauty. Whilst I was making this head, one of the tool makers in the same factory went away and made this during his lunch hour for me, or lunch hours. So there it is, a beautiful little spoke shave. It's a really fantastic tool. I'm very proud to own that. So there's those. But in recent years, I've started using Japanese planes to do this sort of work. And they come like this. Here we've got two sets of planes. Now we're going to look at Japanese planes just very briefly in a minute. But these little chaps, look, are true miniature planes. You can see the shapes of the soles in this middle size. I call these thumb planes and these finger planes. Maybe I'm wrong. The Japanese have probably got some unpronounceable name. But they're a fantastic little tool because they're so accurate to use. You know, take a tool like this little circular hollow, and it will plane. Look at this, the actual precision and the thickness of the shaving we can take. Now in the last 5 or 6 years I've gradually turned to using Japanese tools because of this quality and this precision more and more. And now I'm going to show you something I'm going to really enjoy doing, because I'm going to do my favourite workshop procedure. All of my life I've really enjoyed planing wood, but even more so now because I use these chaps. Now they may look really peculiar to you if you're not used to looking at Japanese tools. They're completely the opposite to everything we have. Let's just look at one in detail first. The wooden part looks very, very simple, but I can assure you it's very, very accurately made. It's called a die. The blade, as with all Japanese tools, is hollow ground and it's made from laminated steel. It fits in the die in these grooves. There is nothing to wedge it in. It fits perfectly in those grooves. So we adjust it very much as we do our own wooden planes until we're happy with it. And this part, which looked just like a wedge, it isn't. It's the back iron, believe it or not. And we adjust the back iron afterwards by putting it in there and advancing it to where we want it. Now, as with all simple things, it works absolutely perfectly. Let me show you a thing or two. Now this big chap would probably be akin to our jack plane, but the bottom isn't perfectly flat. It's been prepared with what we call a standing iron plane, and the plane has been scraped in this area and there and there. So the only part of the sole that touches the wood is here, here, here and here, again behind and there, and that reduces the friction. Something we've never thought about in this country. This is my polishing plane. This I am very, very honoured to have in actual fact, because the iron is made by a top Japanese swordsmith, a descendant from the swordsmiths. When the Emperor of Japan had trouble with the samurai in about 1885, he banned the wearing of swords, and the poor old swordsmiths were out of work overnight, and of course they turned to making woodworking tools. And the Sadahide family are very renowned, and this gentleman is in his late 80s that made this iron. He makes at least 19 irons to get one. He throws the 18 away. The Emperor of Japan was so impressed by this man that he gave him a special award, which is the living treasure of Japan. So I'm very honoured to have that plane. This is my roughing plane. So now let's just put them to use. Now you'll have to bear with me a bit, because quite frankly I enjoy doing this so much that I tend to do my thing. Now look at this, it's pathetic, it's really rough, it's horrible, but just look, this is my roughing plane. Notice it's a Japanese plane, I'm pulling it towards me. Look at that. Look at what's appearing. Well, having knocked the rough off, we can begin to see the beauty of the surface. Now, have you ever considered when you're playing a bit of wood that there is being revealed for the first time ever? You're the first person to ever see that piece of wood and to see its beauty. Now we're truing it. And we can begin to see the real beauty of that piece of walnut. And last, we come to the polishing plane. This is fantastic. The dye for this plane, I've got to tell you, the wood that made that was hung for 10 years in a charcoal kiln. It's made by a special dye maker who only makes dyes for chisorosadarhide. Look at that. Well, there you are. Just look at that. Real beauty. Unfortunately, there's something I can't do on a video. You can't come and feel the surface of that piece of wood, but it's beautiful. Not only is it beautiful to look at, it's beautiful to touch. Now I ask you, can anything in life be better than that?